Okay, welcome to our first set of notes in our cell reproduction unit. This covers mitosis, meiosis, and cancer. Before we can really talk about how cells divide and how and why cells divide, how they replace themselves, we need to talk a little bit about DNA. There's different forms of DNA. Remember, DNA is where your genes are stored. Most of the time, when the cell is not dividing, the DNA is stored in your nucleus, and it's all kind of like a snotty spaghetti mess. It's all wiggly, and we call that form of the DNA chromatin. When the cell's ready to divide, that chromatin starts to wind up almost like braids or something, and then it has a different name. Okay, when the cell is dividing, the DNA starts to twist up and it forms this blue figure that you see on the PowerPoint. That's called a chromosome. Each side of the chromosome is called a sister chromatid. I'm going to suggest that you draw this picture in your notes. So remember, the word we heard before was chromatin when the cell was not dividing and it just looked like messy spaghetti. When it starts to take shape and wrap around itself and look like a letter S, we refer to that as a chromosome. Each side of it is called a chromatid, and the two sides are attached by a protein in the middle called a centromere. There are a lot of C words in this unit, so my apologies on that. So a bivalent chromosome, remember the prefix means the prefix bi means two. A bivalent chromosome has two identical sides that are joined in the middle by a protein called a centromere. Each side of the chromosome is called a chromatid with a D on the end. We learned the word chromatin on the previous slide. The DNA in a chromosome is wrapped around proteins called histones. Now, hopefully you recognize this photograph of the DNA called a karyotype, and by now you're able to identify that the gender of this individual is a male. You see the X and Y chromosomes. We received two copies of each chromosome, one from your mom and one from your father. Those matching pairs are called homologous chromosomes. Remember, the prefix homo means same. The chromosomes aren't necessarily exactly the same, but they have things in common. This is just a photo showing two homologous chromosomes and what they do and don't have in common. The chromosome on the left with the dark blue bands up at the top, that one maybe came from one parent, and the ones with the lavender bands at the top maybe came from the other parent, or did come from the other parent. Maybe both of them carry the gene for eye color. So the one that came from dad maybe carries the gene for brown eye color, whereas the one from mom carries the gene for eye color. But because they're homologous chromosomes, they both carry the gene for eye color. It just doesn't necessarily say the same gene for eye color. So that's what homologous chromosomes are. They're partners. They line up during cell division, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them later. Okay, now to continue on with some of the vocabulary. The prefix di also means two, just like the prefix bi means two. So diploid cells are any cells in the body, whether it's a human or an animal or a plant, that contain those homologous pairs. We refer to them as 2N, two copies of every chromosome. All cells in the human body are diploid, except the sex cells. So the sex cells have a different name. Sperm and eggs are called haploid. Haploid has half the DNA. So underline that HA in haploid and half. Sperm and eggs are called haploid because they carry half the DNA. They carry one chromosome from each homologous pair, so that when you add the two together, you end up with the right amount of DNA. And of course, the reason that haploid cells have only half the DNA, or 23 chromosomes, is that when they come together, they form a diploid organism, an organism that has two of every chromosome. That's it for this set of notes.